If I could speak to my younger self, I would do it calmly and clearly. I would tell him to breathe more often, even in chaos, because life moves fast. I would tell him to stop being so hard on himself. Mistakes are lessons, not failures. I would tell him that love matters more than pride and connection over ego. I would tell him to call his parents and grandparents more while they can still answer. I would tell him to take the trip he's always postponed, even if it seems inconvenient. I would tell him to quit what drains his soul, even if others disapprove. I would tell him that rest is not weakness, but essential for longevity and clarity. Life is not a rehearsal. This moment is the real thing, fleeting and precious. Old age is not regret. It is reflection and the wisdom to see clearly now. I would tell him that time is a gift and each day deserves attention. I would tell him to laugh more, cry freely, and savor emotions fully. I would tell him that relationships and memories matter far more than money. I would tell him to say what he feels before it is too late. I would tell him that presence is the truest gift you can offer anyone. I would tell him to let go of bitterness and embrace forgiveness early. I would tell him that pride and stubbornness only delay happiness. I would tell him to trust himself and his instincts more than the crowd. I would tell him that health is invaluable and must be respected constantly. I would tell him to find balance between ambition and joy. I would tell him that small gestures create lasting impressions. I would tell him to document life with words, pictures, and memories. I would tell him that curiosity is timeless and should never fade. I would tell him to savor ordinary moments because they are extraordinary in retrospect. I would tell him that silence is a teacher and reflection a friend. I would tell him to embrace mistakes and learn without self-loathing. I would tell him to show gratitude daily, even for simple things. I would tell him that effort and presence outweigh perfection. I would tell him to love fully, apologize honestly, and forgive without hesitation. I would tell him that fear is natural and signals what truly matters. I would tell him to act bravely, even when scared, because courage grows with use. I would tell him that life's richness is measured by love, meaning, and wisdom. I would tell him that legacy is built in small, consistent actions, not grand gestures. I would tell him that every day offers a chance to be better, kinder, and wiser. I would tell him that the world will rush past, but he can choose stillness. I would tell him that laughter and joy are not frivolous. They are essential. I would tell him to embrace solitude as a source of clarity, not loneliness. I would tell him that peace is cultivated, not given, and worth pursuing daily. I would tell him that contentment comes from acceptance, not comparison. I would tell him to savor lessons from elders. Their wisdom is priceless. I would tell him that age is a privilege and growing older is a gift. I would tell him to forgive himself early, to avoid carrying unnecessary weight. I would tell him that love given freely is never wasted, no matter the outcome. I would tell him to take risks, pursue passions, and explore the unknown. I would tell him that gratitude transforms life from ordinary to extraordinary. I would tell him that every end is a beginning in disguise. I would tell him that presence in moments matters more than productivity. I would tell him that listening is as powerful as speaking. I would tell him that happiness is a choice, cultivated daily with intention. I would tell him to leave behind resentment and embrace curiosity. I would tell him to mentor, help, and guide others generously. I would tell him to savor friendships and value authentic connections. I would tell him to notice beauty in small things, a smile, a sunrise, a song. I would tell him to celebrate progress, even if it seems slow or incomplete. I would tell him to embrace life fully, with all its nesciences and wonder. I would tell him that self-love is not selfish, it is survival. I would tell him that joy multiplies when shared, and kindness echoes forever. I would tell him to trust the journey, even when it seems unclear. I would tell him that life is fleeting, precious, and profoundly worth living. I would tell him to live in ways his future self will thank him for. I would tell him that wisdom comes from experience, reflection, and grace. I would tell him to love life, embrace lessons, and treasure every moment. I would tell him that the choices made today shape the peace of tomorrow. I would tell him that he is enough exactly as he is and always will be. I would tell him to honor the past, live in the present, and embrace the future. I would tell him that life is a collection of moments, not achievements. I would tell him that happiness is found in simplicity, presence, and love. I would tell him to carry these truths quietly, steadily, and without fear. I would tell him that age is not a limit, but a lens to see clearly. I would tell him that if he lives fully now, old age will be a gift. I would tell him that legacy is not wealth, but love, kindness, and lessons. I would tell him to breathe, trust, and let life unfold as it should. I would tell him to celebrate being alive, because being here is everything,